Greg.
Yeah, Hugo, if you don't mind, maybe a little bit about your background, what you're currently doing, a little bit about your role as executive director, and then just contextually kind of your work in local government and public administration. And I'll mute myself, but certainly Hugo is a great friend, a longtime colleague, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here. And if there's one thing that Hugo and I both enjoy doing, it's opining one another. So I'll pipe in as you need, or try to be as quiet as you wish. So thanks for being here, Hugo. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah. So feel free to chip in. We do our best work when we argue. My background is I recently retired after 31 years in law enforcement. That maybe Greg will have me back for a different conversation on that. I have very strong feelings on the state of law enforcement and how we got to this point, which is not a great point in history or in practice. I did my best to have a different style of policing. I was a strong proponent of something called the social contract, which is quite simply, which does tie into the administrative law discussion, that you should govern or you should interact with a community in the manner in which the community wants to be interacted with. And so the social contract simply says that people in a democratic society agree to forego certain rights, privileges, and freedoms, speeding, laws, etc., to live in a more safe and orderly society. Government or law enforcement, but government for its part must not be punitive or overly egregious in creating this safe environment that people have agreed to give up rights and freedoms to live in. And you can point to any number of issues, whether it's law enforcement or administrative law or city dysfunctions or whatever, that the social contract has not been held is the cherished agreement, unwritten document that it is and should be. And you have great dysfunction and or injury and or death, etc., because of the failure to recognize and embrace that. So, but that's a separate discussion, but it does tie into administrative law. So I started out in law enforcement, like I say, 31 years ago, plus or minus. Did crime scene reconstruction. I thought that was a fascinating field. Gravitated through schooling, etc. Got some promotions. One thing led to another, and during my stints at various cities where the family had lived, served on school boards and volunteer boards and things of that nature to see how things truly work behind the scenes. If you
I hadn't forgotten about your school board years.
Oh boy, those were tumultuous years, because everybody takes personal interest and concern when it involves their child. And if a child was removed from class, ninth grader for whatever, I'm paying, it's taxpayer dollars, I'm paying good money. Why is, my son out of school? I was a school cop for a while too, once upon a time, and that was a totally separate issue. Why do we have school cops? Why are you here? You're busting my kid for pot. Pot's not a crime, blah, blah, blah. It won't be in 2 years, but it was 10 years ago. So things of that nature, lots of levels of bureaucracy, lots of levels of requirements and rules and policies and stuff. I'm I wouldn't say a victim of that at the state, but I'm navigating that at the state. Long story short, though, I did retire from law enforcement. I was a Three Rivers Park District, a very niche type agency, mostly a conservation type law enforcement agency, not terribly different from the DNR, I suppose. Lots of pollution control types of enforcements. I tell people that the typical, criminal law, so there's probably more than three types of law, but the three types of law you'll run into are civil law, personal wrongs against, another individual that don't necessarily affect society. You get into a fight at a bar and you get punched and your tooth gets chipped. That might be a criminal law violation for disorderly conduct or assault, but there's also a civil penalty potentially that you can sue that person for causing personal injury to you, a nuisance, animal violations and junk vehicles in your yard, firewood stacked up on the wrong side of the property. And those are all examples of administrative type offenses that aren't criminal necessarily. So you've got civil offenses, criminal offenses, and then administrative offenses. And here's where where you could really argue it's not double jeopardy, which is a separate legal concept, but I think is really problematic. So, for example, if you get picked up for driving while intoxicated, driving while impaired, if certain aggravating factors exist, yes, you're going to be charged criminally for that violation, but you might administratively, not criminally, administratively forfeit your vehicle due to high alcohol content and whatnot. And that was a group of laws that was rife for abuse, because very clearly there's a conflict of interest, right? If I'm the law enforcement officer, I stop somebody for DWI and their car now becomes forfeitable, which means I take it away from them. I can now sell that and keep that money to be used for other drug enforcement situations. Is there not an incentive for me to do more of that? Clearly, yes, because I can pad my budget in tight tax years, and therefore I can be more aggressive and approach crossing that line in theory. Now, obviously, you never should do that. I'm not advocating that. But a lot of people were having their vehicles taken from them only to be rewarded or awarded back 6 months after they went to trial, that the officer didn't have enough grounds to keep the vehicle. And, but that person was deprived of the vehicle for 6 months, as an example. That's an example of an administrative law. Probably that's a bridge too far, because not only was that person consequenced for the driving violation and the drinking violation, but they also administratively lost their vehicle. When you get your driver's license suspended, that's not criminally, that's administratively. So there's all these overlapping laws and rules that come into play that it really can get convoluted, and to try to navigate that is very confusing. So you have my empathy as you're discovering different nuances and aspects of the law. But point being, there's different types of law. We're just going to focus on the narrow sliver that is administrative law. If you had a bookshelf at home, criminal law probably takes up your typical chunky novel that you might read. It might be a foot and a half of space on your counter or in your bookshelf. Administrative law is probably another 3-4 inches beyond that, and civil law is probably the rest of the shelf. So there's voluminous amounts of statutes already on the books, which does not talk about rules, which does not talk about practice, which does not talk about policy, which we addressed earlier. So I thought I would hit on probably 3 or 4 key touch points, and hopefully that generates some conversation or questions or discussion. But I thought I would go for maybe, 20 minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes, we'll see, and then stand for questions throughout. So if you have questions, just go ahead and interrupt me. But
I'm gonna pay you serious money if you can keep comments to 20 minutes first. I've known you for 20 years.
We're out. See, you keep interrupting me, Greg, and I'm gonna go off on another rabbit trail.
But before you get going, I appreciate that, Hugo. I think some deliverable points will be helpful from your experience. But could you talk a little bit about the agency that you're running now for the state, kind of how it fits into the BCA, and what type of work you do, just to kind of give context for the group. I think it's a great example of the state's delegation of authority, and how operations and procedures really do play out in the context of admin law.
Sure. So if you weren't aware, pretty much any service industry has a regulatory board, from chiropractic to arborists to people doing your nails at the mall to yes, a private detective and protective agents board. So I'm now the executive director. After I retired, I was an appointee by the Commissioner of Public Safety, who happens to be John Harrington. And he asked me to step in and run the private detective board, because that was essentially an administrative function gone awry. Lots of inconsistent enforcement of rules and statutes and practice, and the industry was suffering because of that. I think the board was doing a good job, but there's high turnover in staff, shortage of staff, et cetera. So what I do and what my staff do. Well, there's only 4 things by statute that we're allowed to do, which is fine by me. We vet new applications for people who want to be a private investigator or a security officer. So we vet new applications. We vet renewal applications. A license is good for 2 years. We certify all training. It has to meet certain requirements of statute. And then we investigate any complaints of license activity. Well, most of the license holders are law-abiding. They're doing what they need to do. There's some mistakes along the way, but by and large, the biggest complaint we get are people who aren't licensed, people who are doing security work or violence disruptors, what have you, doing otherwise very noble work, potentially, but they're not licensed. So we get complaints on that. Well, we have no authority to do that. So the legislature, in its infinite wisdom, created this board to regulate things, but they stopped short of regulating the unlicensed activity, and that falls to local law enforcement as a criminal violation. And so administrative law went so far, and then it stopped. Probably should have went that extra step to do the investigations on unlicensed activity, but our authority was limited in that respect, and so that gets farmed off to local law enforcement. But we have about 13,000 people working in the private investigator or security industry in the state. And those folks work under about 500 different licenses. So if you want to start your security company, Hugo McPhee Security, I can hire 50, 20, 250, however many people I want. I just pay a certain fee for that. And all those folks work under my license. So that's the regulatory board that I lead. I worked just briefly helping them get their feet on the ground at the EMSRB, which is the Emergency Medical Services Regulatory Board. And not to pick on those folks, but they are the victim of a lot of unfunded mandates. If you have a complaint against a paramedic who responded to your house because your wife or your husband was having a heart attack, and did something that you felt was inappropriate, either from care of the individual or rudeness or whatever, you could, in theory, file a complaint with this regulatory board and have licensed actionable things occur. But they were fully 2 years behind on any complaint investigation. So how in the world can you provide any meaningful service to anybody if you file a complaint today and we'll get to it March 13th, 2024. I mean, who does that, you know? So wildly understaffed, wildly unable to keep up. I spent some time, as I mentioned before, in great comment on school boards and city government and whatnot. And if there is an underlying theme, it's you know, the overlap of jurisdictions and the overlap of responsibilities. So case in point, we're responsible to make sure people who are in the security industry have ID cards and things of that nature, and certain looking uniforms. Probably a third of our complaints against security individuals are from other departments of the state. There's a state auditors division. There's when the line 3 pipeline was going through, they had people from Minnesota Management and Budget checking the IDs on people and whatnot, sending us complaints that so-and-so, this company didn't have IDs on their staff. So we've got multiple regulatory agencies stepping over themselves to what end. So great overlap, great inefficiency, sending us complaints that people weren't dressed properly and this, that, and the other. So if as you grow into these positions in your careers, that'd be very helpful to keep that in mind, of the overlap and the multiple jurisdictional issues with so many of these laws, not just that statutes and rules, et cetera, but it can be very complex, and then try not to be in flux with that. Let me talk just briefly on we did mention, and this is important, I think, practice versus policy versus rules versus statutes. Statutes typically are the highest weighted enforcement arm, then followed by rules. And the problem with rules is the boards themselves can make up their own rules. They have a hearing with the administrative office. the Secretary of State, and if nobody contests it and they publish it. How many times? When's the last time you've been to the private detective website to see what rules we're proposing? Nobody knows where it is. Sometimes I don't know where it is. And so a lot of stuff can get passed, and there's not true audience to these things, which I think is an issue. I think that's a real problem. And now you've got these laws in place, and they also don't always rescind previous rules or statutes. So now you have rules in conflict with statutes. It can be very, very onerous and problematic. It goes to the multi layers of government and bureaucracy, like Greg was talking previously. One thing, so working in state government has been very, very eye-opening to me, coming from municipal government. State government is wondrously, how do I want to say this, divided in its role, function, scope, etc. And there's so many siloed, and when I say wondrously, it's not like it's a good thing. It's just wondrously, that's just so the machinations of the interactions is just really beyond compare. Case in point today, I spent probably 2 hours this afternoon working with the Minnesota Management and Budget Office. Somebody had forgot that the courier service contract expired February 28th. So come March 1st, there's no courier picking up money at the various licensing center or this, that, and the other, wherever the state collects money, which is pretty much everywhere. So they're rapidly trying to put together a contract. Well, the company that had the contract before is not interested because the state is very bureaucratic and onerous. You must do this, you must do this, you must do this. You must wear a mask if you're in any, now that's kind of going away, but mask if you're in any buildings, They're very, very rigid with what you need to do. Well, this company, there's only a few that are big enough to handle that kind of workload, wasn't interested in doing that. And what's more, the state said, we're not going to have one contract for all of our offices. We're going to have one contract for DPS, one contract for Health and Human Services, one contract for IT, whatever. Well, so it was, many, many, many times more work and much more difficult. So this company backed us, and well, we're not interested. To which the state says, what do you mean you're not interested? You have to. So, well, no, we don't have to do anything. This is, free enterprise. If you want to maintain the rules of operation that we had in place before, yeah, we're interested, but no, we're not going to break it out as you see fit. So you've had this wonderful, quote unquote, wonderful overlap of responsibilities and jurisdictions. Somebody was responsible for setting up this a courier service and dropped the ball, and now there's literally like a dozen or more agencies who don't have courier service, so they're calling state troopers and local law enforcement to run money for them. Well, that's not in their wheelhouse necessarily. Very, very problematic. And so I'm not sure what they're going to do. So they called me to see what I can do if I have any contacts. And I said, well, sure, but I can't make people, I guess I'd look at your contract and make it more favorable so that people want to do business with you and not be this onerous thing. But there again, somebody was responsible for tracking this for all these different agencies and dropped the ball. And now all these agencies are left holding the bag that, well, who's going to pick up our money kind of thing. So I don't know. Mary, do you have anything? You're looking like you're either sleeping, nodding off, or nodding in agreement. I'm not sure which, but am I hitting a tone there, or what do you got?
Mary, me?
Yeah.
No, it's just interesting.
Yeah, it's just goofy how that can be overlooked, and that was, there's very, very well-paid people who overlook this, and it's like, well, how does that happen? But there again, it's the whole administrative oversight. If you've got the laws in place, administrative law in place, and responsibilities and the roles, somebody has to be monitoring that. You can't just forget about this. Somebody's got to keep the plate spinning, multitasking, keeping things going. So, I just found that just to be crazy. Then the other thing I've noticed in respect to administrative rules and procedures here at the state is it's very easy to plug and play that. Well, that's not my job. IT. Before you can come to fix my computer, fix your computer, you need to contact the help desk. They'll send a ticket, and then you have this round robin, very circuitous process, which I'm sure if you've got 50,000 employees, how else are you going to do it? Maybe, right? I don't know, but when you just have that sheer volume, you tend to lose sight of the customer. You tend to lose sight of the person that you're really, should be the benefactor of the law. If you're in government. Greg, what's the role of government? Is it not to create or help foster a safe and productive environment for the citizens, or something similar to that, I would guess. And if you're not doing that, it's like, well, why are you doing the service? So I want to touch on that as an example, but maybe the last item to touch on is the unfunded mandate aspect due to these conflicting duplication of rules and et cetera. So there's a statute. So statute's very high. So we have no option but to do this. That every 2 years we have to recertify all submitted training submitted to the private detective board. Well, as we sit here right now, there's 1,270 courses that have been pre-approved over the years, and they're all due March 31st to be reevaluated. I found this out about 4 months ago. Had in theory time. We have no staff to vet this. If you did the math, if you're working 5 days a week times 52 weeks, whatever the quick math is, and is that 220 some days maybe? I'm not sure. But you'd have to do like 4 courses a day, not counting vacations, to make sure you did all these reviews. And then even then you're not staying on top of it. And I just had 6 more classes come through today that, because people they want to put classes on so you can charge people to attend your stuff. And at some point there's gonna be 3,000 classes or 4,000 classes, and there's no end in sight. And to date, the legislature hasn't seen fit to remedy that, or to let us at least charge. I'm not looking to make money, but if you charge somebody $50 to review their class, you're not going to be ginning out probably as many classes, because now, well, maybe it's $100. I mean, whatever the magic number is. People are going to be only truly putting forward, perhaps classes for the good of the order kind of thing. But that's a clear unfunded mandate, not unlike the AMSRB, where they didn't have staff to do the investigations. And so, that's the other side of administrative laws. You keep making more laws and rules and practices and policies, and who's able to follow them? So, if I've got. I'll show you real quickly. This, you can see, I think it's a 3.5 inch binder. This is part of the rules that we have to follow. Part of the rules. It's like, and these go back to the 70s. I couldn't even tell you half the stuff, because you kind of gravitate to what is comes up on a daily basis. But if there's a real oddball nuance that somebody has a question on, it's like, oh, well, I'll get back to you. Give me an hour and a half to sift through it. And so I think, Thalia, you had said, interested in serving in politics. Like that's a real drawback when you have overlapping statutes and rules, and things just keep piling up and piling up. So maybe we should have a law holiday where you take off 2 or 3 laws off the book sometimes. But Greg, what's the next chapter or the next section that you guys are talking about? Maybe I can speak to that. Or does anybody have any questions on anything? I don't want to ramble endlessly here. Maybe it's too late.
Let's do some questions just on your experience, your work, how it might relate to administrative law, or just in general. Questions for you, Hugo. You have a very unique background, and I'm sure that could lend some perspective to the group.
Sure.
Well, I have a question. So for instance, and Greg is probably familiar with this. So when the DNR makes rules, I think that would be correct. So we have something called the Mississippi River Critical Corridor Area. And because we're on the Mississippi River, they have these rules that they wrote. And so how do we as a city know if their rules are more stringent than what they were given the power to do?
Oh,
And
yeah.
I don't know if I'm asking
Yeah.
that correctly, but so we were looking at it today, the mayor and I, and it's like, well, the DNR basically wrote our zoning code because they covered everything. So, and we have to follow it. So I'm just wondering like, how do you know if they're going beyond what the authority they were given?
So
Go ahead, Hugo.
Yeah, I'll just say real quick. So they have to be able to tell you what they're referencing that gives them the authority. You know, states statute 14.63, whatever, and whether you find that or they make that available to you, and to see what it is, because if question, I mean, they should do this just as a matter of course. But if question, they need to show you where they're deriving their authority from, and if it is a water area, they do have, they and the Minnesota Pollution Control have great autonomy in creating rules and whatnot that may not be to the level of statute, but still have a heavy weight that you have to conform to. But I would ask them for what the rule is, and then read it, and you maybe have to get legal counsel too to interpret it if it's particularly complex. But they need to have it, everything, all decisions have to be based on some statute or rule that gives them the authority to do that.
I read state statutes a lot, and to me they can seem so vague.
Yeah.
So that's kind of frustrating at times.
Absolutely. And I think that as we look into week 3 and start talking about the rulemaking process, really designed to supposedly lend transparency and public interaction, I think it's one of the biggest critiques of kind of the administrative state, right? That and probably, frankly, why we all might gravitate towards a negative definition of bureaucracy as we started off the conversation today. So I think that's I think it's an important point and one worth exploring as we think about how might we do this better in public administration.
Right. I like that. How can we make this, how can we change government to actually work for the people? Because I'm a strong believer that government is meant to work for the people, to provide a better lifestyle, a better living, a safer living, better drinking water, all these sorts of things. And oftentimes the stuff that gets enacted has no effect on that. It just becomes one more layer of bureaucracy that you have to conform to, which at some point becomes increasingly more difficult.
I think it's kind of going off of that, and you mentioned that, I don't know if it was specific to BCA, but like rules, all the rules that are just published by the agency and some of them conflict. Is there any sort of audit that takes place or overview, oversight, I guess?
Yep. So the official rules, so you might have agency rules where the boards, and I did not make the distinctions. This is a very good question. So in the hierarchy, you have statutes, which are discussed at the legislative level. You have rules, which are discussed at an administrative hearing level. So that's a court proceeding versus legislature. And then you have the actual policies and practices of the agency. And with that, they can make up their own rules. Like my board can say, Hugo, we want you to go out and now audit all of the license holders and do inspections. We'll, whether you have staff for that or not, we'll get you staff, whatever. That's a rule with a small r, we'll say, that actually has a force and impact of law, because that's coded in the statute that allows the board to make up these decisions. And it becomes very difficult. And again, if you're the subject of any of these, audits, investigations, or whatever, that regulatory agency does have to show back where they're getting their authority from. And sometimes it is like reading VCR instructions and stuff, but it's a very confusing world, I would say, and I live in it now. I've lived in it with law enforcement, but it's a very, and then you have attorneys, argue it back and forth. Well, the comma was after this, that therefore that's a separate incident and a separate, section versus, if the comma wasn't. This is, true discussions I've been part of. So yeah, it's not clear cut. It's gray and it's murky. So you'd think laws might be black and white, but they're really not. Anybody else? Any thoughts, questions, or? And I found this to be interesting. We're one of like at least 36 or 37 boards that I'm aware of. And it's like it's really from soup to nuts. There's a regulatory board out there somewhere, monitoring, and you probably need to, right? I sound like I'm picking on regulatory boards, of which I am one. So you probably need that to a certain extent, but you also have to have the right mindset of people trying to do the right thing. Is it an innocent mistake? Has anybody been hurt from it? If not, hey, this is what you need to do. This is what the law says you're required to do. Let's get there and let's move on, rather than being punitive. Well, that's a $1,500 fine. And that's, for us, any violation is a $500 fine. Application renewals are due the first of the month. If one comes in on March 4th, March 5th, that's a $500 fine. Am I going to hang a $500 fine on people? It's like, hey, as you know, these are due the first of the month. We'll make note of it. The board can do what they want with it, but I'm not going to recommend fining people for that. We're in this together, sort of, aren't we? We're all just trying to, provide for families and society and what have you. So maybe I'm altruistic.
Other questions for Hugo?
Yeah, go ahead. Thalia, I see your hand's up.
Yeah, so I guess with your discussion of like the way in which legislature interacts with regulatory boards, what degree of the rulemaking of regulatory boards is these boards reacting to legislation and making rules as per the requirements of legislation precisely, and how much of it is based on that discretion of, well, this is how we could operate it better?
Yeah, that's really, really insightful. So speaking for my board, it's made up of, so this is good and bad, right? It's made up of industry professionals. So you have a public member, and then everybody else is in the industry in one way, shape, or form. So hopefully, and that's been my experience, but hopefully everybody's altruistic, wanting things to be done more safely, more efficiently, et cetera. But if the wrong mix of people got on the board, maybe it's the arborist, association, or the landscape design people, they have a board too. They can kind of, like when I was on the school board, there was definitely a force of people who wanted to hijack the curriculum to a certain angle. And if you're not active on that, and if they've got the votes, that's what's going to be approved. And so to your point, I think there is some of that where it could be done to potentially circumvent statute. My experience here has been that they're very much trying to clarify things to make it easier. And that's probably, cross my fingers, what most boards are like. But you look at the post board. So I presented in front of the post board to change the laws around domestic violence and some things like that to really hold law enforcement officers accountable. If you're abusing your spouse, domestic violence, you ought not be in the field. Take your license. Thanks for playing. See you later. And the post board, this is probably now 6-7 years ago, did not take any action on that. I had a bunch of information from domestic advocates, and we had studies and such, and they did not feel that was an issue. And so they didn't even hear. We didn't have a chance to present our information. They just didn't want to hear it. But on the board, you had a heavy mix of law enforcement, some minuscule and others, and some public members. But all they needed was 8 of the 14 people to not want to hear it, and you don't get to hear it. So I think some boards can be very self-serving and very protective of things. And I don't know the short answer for that, but you can tell I'm disappointed with the state of law enforcement. Who isn't, maybe, right? But yeah, it's I better stop talking before Greg gets a complaint. Who was that guy? He hates the cops. He was a cop. I do not hate law enforcement. I mean, salt of the earth. Anybody in the military and law enforcement, or really anybody in public service should be recognized, and that includes probation officers and human service workers, and everybody's doing some really important stuff, especially in today's day and age. So I
think it's an important question, an important realization that there never will be a clean delineation or separation from politics and policy making, from the art and craft and the small bit of science that goes into public administration, right? I mean, at the end of the day, discretion, delegation of authority, there is clear influences from policy making and political decision making.
That's really a good point, Greg. And Thalia, thanks for spurring the conversation, because every decision, even at the police chief level, at my level, every decision is a political decision. You think you're doing exactly what's right, and this is ethics and this is whatnot, but there's somebody somewhere who is, if it comes out a different way, you're going to hear about it. Everybody has a boss, and your boss has a boss. And to think that there's not influence, I mean, you have to do what you have to do. I mean, ethically, morally, responsibly. But yeah, there's always a hint of politics to especially some of these headier conversations, for sure. Absolutely.
I think that also goes to play just by and large, experts, professionals executing the operations and procedures for this whole definition and discussion of administrative law is also heavily influenced by the fact, at least in my experience, that politics matters in local government, right? The core of everything I do is going to be what creates a great experience for the people who are impacted and part of our community. And I always have to put on the lens of how are my elected officials choosing their words and actions based on how they want others to react to what they're doing, which is, in my mind, the very definition of politics, right? So that is always in a lens that is going to impact an administrative agency and those of us who are delegated authority to use our professional discretion to make decisions on behalf of the community in hopes of best serving most efficiently, most effectively.
I would imagine that in Burnsville, just knowing Greg, if this does come up, and it may not, but Greg would be a very strong buffer between city council and staff to allow staff to do their job unfettered. When I was at the Park District, my experience was 180 degrees opposite. I was routinely getting calls from either from my boss, the superintendent, or a fair amount of times from board members. How come this happened? I got a complaint on this. What's the story on that? Totally circumventing, the line of commands. They should be talking to the superintendent. He should be talking to me, or I should be talking to the officers. Not, kind of doing an end run on that. But that's where quality, quote unquote, quality board representation, where people know their roles and their limitations, comes into play, or a strong leader to correct them when they do step out of that, because that is a very difficult place to be. And you have to be ethical and precise and all of that, and you can't have these ulterior interest trying to impact you, but it happens very frequently.
I think that's a good point, Hugo. It's no secret that, particularly at the local level, good government is the result of good governance. Elected boards, by and large, in the world that we live in, particularly in the state of Minnesota, are charged with the policy making activities of the communities in which, or the areas in which, they're elected to represent. That is the beauty and the curse of representative democracy. Where the rubber meets the road is are those individual elected officials being able to function well together as a board, in my case, as a local city council. And I think that the example can play on, but certainly in Burnsville, we depend heavily on our council's adopted governance policies to create an environment where we can all work together as a team to create a better future for our community, but everyone knows their roles and we know who's talking to who about what. Because where administrative agencies and delegation of authority breaks down is when the wrong people are in the wrong business doing the wrong things, right? When elected officials are showing up to a code enforcement inspection or a building inspection and inserting their authority is the exact time where the delegation of authority and discretion breaks down. At that point in time, then staff who are trying to operationalize the delegated authority of local ordinance are unable to do that because of the political influence, right? So that's where good governance kind of comes into play. And would love to say that we have it nailed down here in Burnsville, but we're working.
Yeah. I will say that is my biggest concern as leading a regulatory board is the unfunded aspects of, let's say some security officer gets into a shootout, during some, patrol interaction, which has happened in the recent past. And they point to the class that we approve or the class that we didn't get to reapproving, and it has flawed training regimens in it. Their defense is, well, we did what was, at the time approved by the licensing board, and how can you hold me accountable for that? And if something like that slips through, certainly we have egg on our face. Is there any culpability, liability? Depends. I mean, some of it you're indemnified, but if it's gross negligence on our part for not doing what we're set up to do, I think there is some culpability there, and certainly there's some employment issues that I might be looking for work. So that scares me when you have these unfunded mandates that you have to stay abreast on, because there's some of these are just physically impossible to do.
I just put a link to our governance standards in Burnsville, something that I'm proud of, that I think is important in this discussion, being that it came up. There's a link in the chat if you're interested in that.
And any other question? I hit my 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I hit all five talking points that I wanted to touch on. So or Greg, if you had anything you wanted me to.
No, Hugo, I really appreciate it. I said this at the beginning. I consider Hugo a very good friend. He is an example of what we need more of in leadership, particularly at the local level. He thinks differently. He thinks about the human side of the work that we all do in public administration, and all too often it feels like these days we lose sight of some of that. And offers an incredibly unique and important perspective and voice. And it's the reason that our Commissioner of Public Safety has tapped him for many things, including his current role in the world of helping us to not only be better, but to be our best, particularly at the local level on law enforcement. So, Hugo, I always appreciate your perspective. Look Hugo up on LinkedIn or reach out to him. He's an expert in the space of ethics and leadership, and I appreciate, Hugo, you taking the time to share a little bit of your wisdom and chat with us a little bit tonight about how the rubber meets the road, so to speak, in terms of administrative law. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And if you do reach out to LinkedIn, or you can get my email from Greg, I'd happy to do that. Keep me as a contact if you're ever looking for state employment or anything that I can help with. I'll bend your ear over coffee or something and help spitball maybe career strategies and things like that. But yeah, I'm here to help. I I think if we're lucky enough to be, in these positions of authority and responsibility, we have a responsibility to help others get there too. And, whatever we can do to make the world, I just mean this, make the world a better place, because there's plenty going on that's not so good. So.
Well, thanks again, Hugo. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for your questions and your interactions tonight. Hopefully it was helpful. So I appreciate it. And thanks again to Hugo.
All right. See you,
Thanks,
everybody.
Hugo.
Good
Thank
luck.
you.
Thank you.
Yep.